Welcome back to Comic Crackle. I'm your host and alternate dimension version of Jack Kirby, who specifically only loves talking about Jack Kirby. It's weird, I know, just go with it. So, as a lot of people know that subscribe to the channel, I'm a real big fan of Jack Kirby's Fourth World. And today we're going to be doing something that I'm starting to call prep time. And what this is going to be is everything that you need to know from Jack Kirby's Fourth World to jump into Ram V and Evan Cagle's The New Gods #1. This is going to be a little bit different than some of my previous videos, so you kind of have context whenever you're going in and reading The New Gods #1. And you might be asking why I wanted to make this video. I mean, I already have the analysis of The New Gods and then diving in a little bit for the Forever people, but this video in particular is trying to target the people that wouldn't pick up The New Gods #1 because they didn't read the Jack Kirby series and they're not familiar with any of the characters. So this is kind of an entry-level look at this series and what you need to know. And also I'm trying to boost sales for Ram V's book because we're besties on Twitter. So now all of the setup is out of the way, let's hear a message from our sponsor. We actually have one this time. You want to start reading books outside of Marvel and DC, but don't really know where to start? Well, look no farther. I have the perfect service for you. Global Comics is a service for you to be able to read over 70,000 comics from 350 different publishers, including Image, Dark Horse, Boom Studios, Oni Press, and so much more. Do you want to read any of the independent work that I talk about on the channel? Well, I read it on Global Comics, and you should too. Also, they just partnered with DC Comics to provide select titles, so it's really your one-stop shop for all of your comic needs. Global Comics allows for the reader to optimize their reading experience by really just form-fitting it to what you specifically want. If you're reading on an iPad or on your computer or on your phone, it's going to be different reading experiences, and Global Comics takes that into account. Do you see something that you like, but you're currently binging a different series and you want to come back to it later? Just save those comics on your favorites tab. That's what I did. And for the next couple of videos, I've specifically handpicked all of these books so that way I can read them later. The greatest aspect of Global Comics, specifically for me, is that they allow to distribute those royalties back to the comics creators that made those series. They do this by ensuring up to 70% of your subscription is going back to those original creators from the works that you read on their app. With new issues being published on a daily basis and new publishers and comic creators coming on board, this is the perfect time to start your comics journey. Start with Global Comics today. So go to the link in the description, or when you're on the app making your account, use the code COMICCRACKLE to get your first year for $59.99. And don't be shy. Go ahead and explore the type of membership that fits your reading needs. But you know, it'd be really cool if you got the discounted yearly membership with my code. Thank you to Global Comics for sponsoring this video. And now, back to your normal programming. Okay, if you watch the Fourth World analysis video, this is going to sound repetitive. But this is for the newer viewers, so you can skip past this part. Or if you want to hear me talk about Stan Lee and how much I hate him, you can stay. So as you know, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby worked together in the 60s to formulate a lot of the characters that have been adapted for the big screen, specifically at Marvel Comics. They worked together and co-created the Fantastic Four, Thor, the Avengers, and brought back Captain America. So why did Jack leave? Based on the biography of Jack Kirby titled Kirby, King of Comics, Mark Evanier, the author, talks about Jack leaving because he wasn't getting proper payment and royalties over the characters that he co-created. A lot of the time, Stan Lee would take credit for the creations done by Jack Kirby and claiming that he did the majority of the work, which wasn't actually true. The problem came whenever Jack Kirby's contract ran out, and Jack asked for higher payment because he felt like he was doing the majority of the work. Realistically, Jack Kirby was doing about 75% of the work of the books that were done, and that's just because Stan Lee was overseeing and quote-unquote writing all of these books. So what did that look like? Both sides would claim that they would have a phone call and basically talk about the plot, and then Jack claims that he would get off the phone, completely throw out those ideas, and work on one of the next issues that they were doing. In that time, he would not only introduce all of these concepts, but he would also properly pace the stories, leaving dialogue slots out for Stan to figure out later. Doing the pacing of these books is basically telling Stan what to put in there to drive that story forward, but the plot comes from Jack Kirby. So he wanted to get proper credit, and can't fault him for that. He wasn't even saying to get Stan off of those books. He just wanted to be credited as a co-writer, but Marvel didn't go for that because that would mean that they would have to pay Jack Kirby more. So as I talked about in the Etrigan video, Carmine Infantino came to Jack Kirby promising that he would have full autonomy over the books that he was working on. Specifically, and I'm going to highlight this, he would not have to work with a writer overseeing his work. He was completely by himself and given the ability to tell the stories that he wanted to do without adhering to a writer messing up his work. So Jack goes over to DC and he basically says, give me the book that doesn't have a current creative team, because he didn't want to put other creators out of work. And what they said was Jimmy Olsen would be the one for him to go over and work on first. So he starts on Jimmy Olsen and he starts peppering in the Kirbyisms that we know and love and using this as a backdoor pilot to jumpstart his new ideas. So the stories that he was trying to backdoor pilot actually came from Thor. So what he wanted to do over at Marvel while he was still there is do a Ragnarok for Thor and all of those characters, effectively killing them all off and then starting with new God. That's how we got here. So he takes those core concepts of an idea and he brings them over to DC, basically jumpstarting his own mythos. While I'm talking about the history lesson, let's also talk about the reading order. So basically, he goes over in 1969, he starts on Jimmy Olsen, otherwise known as Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen. He worked on that book for a little while and then also launched New Gods and the Forever People. Those books came out simultaneously, so they can be read at the same time. What I always recommend is to buy the box set. And let me see if I can pick this up real quick. Right here, the box set, it covers all 4 of the series. And what you're going to want to do is go series by series. So first, read Jimmy Olsen in its entirety. That doesn't have a lot to do with the entirety of the New Gods saga. But then you're going to want to go over to New Gods and Forever People. Like I said before, you can read them simultaneously and it doesn't really matter. But I always recommend to read New Gods first and then the Forever People next. And lastly, you're going to go to Mr. Miracle. This is the longest out of all of the series. Really, it's 18 issues where New Gods and the Forever People only made it to issue 11. This is because it was still selling really well at the time and DC wanted to continue this one. And after you finish Mr. Miracle, you're going to go back to the New Gods book. Weird, I know. But basically in 1984, Jack Kirby came back to the company and wrote a quote-unquote end to the New Gods. This is out of continuity and there was a lot of editorial interference. So it's not required reading, but it still is fun to watch Jack Kirby 10 years later come back to his creations and tell the effective end of the New Gods. So going from there, we're going to go into Jimmy Olsen. Okay, so like I said a minute ago, Jimmy Olsen is kind of attached to the Fourth World, and what I mean by that is that Darkseid appears and then also Inner Gang. So Inner Gang is basically mobsters that are given apocalypse tech to just run havoc in Metropolis. It's a small plot point, but it's basically revealed that Darkseid is the one that's supplying all of this tech, obviously making it a problem for Superman and Jimmy Olsen. It doesn't overtly tie in to the Fourth World saga, but I always recommend it. It's Kirby whenever he's first getting over to DC, and you can tell that he has so much passion and he wants to do really weird and abstract work. I mean, just look at this page. It's completely collage work and it's really Kirby swinging for the fences, and I really appreciate it. So it's tying all of these concepts in to have Jimmy lead the Newsboy Legion along with Guardian. And on top of that, Superman is like trying to navigate why Jimmy is being so rebellious, and it's just filled with all of this exuberance, and I just love it. If nothing else, overall, it's not a necessary read, but I highly suggest it if you want to dip your toe into the Kirby craziness. And on top of that, Matt Fraction actually wrote a Jimmy Olsen series that's heavily influenced by Kirby. So if you like that series, you're probably going to like this one. Now, to the New Gods. Okay, so to make it a little bit easier whenever we're diving into the new gods, I set up a timeline. So the book starts and it talks about the old gods, and the old gods die. That's the first line of the first issue. And if we're going back to previously in the video talking about Jack Kirby taking those concepts of the Norse mythology and actually doing a Ragnarok, the old gods dying is the result of that. So when those old gods died, the world that they lived on basically blew up and then was formed into New Genesis and Apocalypse. So if you're thinking about this, New Genesis is basically heaven while Apocalypse is hell. Going on, there's a war because there always has to be a war between heaven and hell. And from that war, it results in the pact. Now I'm going to be talking about this a little bit later, but this is basically a treaty between New Genesis and Apocalypse, which is then broken. Because of course it is, and that's where we start our journey. So with the start of the new war is where we pick up in issue 1. But before we get into issue 1, we have to talk about some of the characters within the series. Starting off, we have the two rulers of the two planets. For New Genesis, it's Highfather, and for Apocalypse, it's Darkseid. You might have heard of him. Our main protagonist in New Gods is Orion. See, Orion kind of encapsulates this entire war between New Genesis and Apocalypse because he's the biological son of Darkseid raised by Highfather. He has this internal struggle, and I talked about that in the last New Gods video. But specifically, he has all of this rage and he wants to be the champion, but he doesn't feel like he's actually a person from New Genesis. He feels like he's lesser, and he always puts himself below the people of New Genesis, but he doesn't know why. Orion's kind of a case study for nature versus nurture. In his mind, biologically being the son of Darkseid means that he must fulfill the role of Darkseid, but he's constantly trying to do good. And even though he sees himself as lower, he wants to live up to being the son of Highfather rather than the son of Darkseid. While we're talking about Orion, we should talk about his friend, Lightray. Lightray is one of my favorite characters within the series. He kind of balances out Orion's dark and gloomy personality with being this hopeful optimist. He's one of the younger New Gods, but he wants to do so much for New Genesis and wants to be that partner with Orion. He's kind of impulsive, but he has all of this ambition that's within him that he's constantly chasing the approval of not only Highfather, but Orion as well. Moving on from those two, we also need to talk about Metron. See, Metron is one of the New Gods, but he's neither good nor evil. He's kind of in the middle because he's the god of information. He's on this never-ending quest to explore the universe. Metron is interesting because he doesn't have an alignment with New Genesis or Apocalypse. He's basically this middle person between the two and is just on a search for knowledge. He wants the fourth world to live on, so he kind of waters down everything coming from Darkseid and Apocalypse, but he tries to be impartial in all of his decisions. He's basically like a cosmic explorer. A couple other characters that you need to know of ahead of time would be Kalibak and Darkseid. So Darkseid is basically the number 2 for Darkseid, and he makes all of these contraptions that exacerbate fear. Kalibak, on the other hand, is the biological son of Darkseid, just like Orion, but he's the one that they acknowledge. Darkseid basically threw away Orion because that was his bastard son, but Kalibak is the rightful heir to Darkseid's throne, although Darkseid never acts like it. Kalibak is always seeking his father's approval and is making everyone well aware that he's the biological son of Darkseid, but he'll never live up to what Orion means to Darkseid. So moving on from them and talking about another character that's kind of ambiguous in their alignment is the Black Racer. If you've read Final Crisis or some of the work that Grant Morrison has done with the New Gods, you might be aware of this character, but for those that haven't, let me break it down a little bit. So the Black Racer is this embodiment of death, and a lot like death, it's something that you can't escape. So he's supposed to be faster than any living being, and if he touches you, you cease to exist. Before we can actually go into the story, there are some Kirby concepts that I do need to make you aware of. So the source is basically like religion in the fourth world. There's good and bad, and what that's exemplified in is life versus anti-life. Life is never-ending optimism, and anti-life is dread. Life is brought out through love and appreciation and words of affirmation, while anti-life is basically used to control others surrounding you. Kirby used the fourth world to basically warn of the rising in fascism, and basically saying that the rhetoric that's spewed by people to say everything is doom and gloom is actually spreading anti-life. And on the other hand, life is the rejection of that notion. It's saying that you can't be controlled by one person. So if anti-life is fascism, then life is anti-fascism. Makes you think. The last bit you need to know of is mother boxes. You might have heard of them multiple times and not really sure what they do. Mother boxes really don't do just one specific task. It's stated within the series that mother boxes basically do whatever you need it to do. Get from one location to the next, heal yourself, put on a different face. We'll get to that later. The mother box is basically the ultimate Deus Ex Machina. It'll get you out of any situation, and you'll see that a lot with Mr. Miracle. Okay, so now that you have the majority of the ideas of the timeline and then the characters that appear, we can jump into the story. Okay, so as we go into the New Gods and what happens in the story, we basically start off, like I said, depicting the death of the old gods and how Apocalypse and New Genesis came to be. To make it a little bit easier for the characters that I'm going to be talking about, I basically put their alignment within New Genesis and Apocalypse, and then in the middle, Metron and Black Racer, which I had spoken about before, they don't really have alliances. So in issue 1, the source basically reveals to Highfather and Orion that there's an incoming battle with Apocalypse. Something escalated recently. So Highfather sends Orion out to Apocalypse to find out what's going on. Orion arrives on Apocalypse and he finds out that Calabac actually took humans prisoner, and the reason that he did this is because the anti-life equation can be found in humans. So Darkseid is going into humans' minds and trying to find the one that holds the anti-life equation. Like we were saying before, the anti-life equation is the control over others. So it's not like Deceased, if you've read that, where once you have the anti-life equation, you become a zombie. No, it's not right. So Orion takes the humans and he goes through a boom tube that leads to Earth, with Calabac stranded on Apocalypse and not able to follow him. Now that they arrive on Earth, Orion basically herds all of them like sheep and says that he needs to stomp out any forces of the invasion that Darkseid is bringing onto Earth. And of course, Darkseid is making all of these contraptions to try to stir up the anti-life equation and basically pinpoint which humans have the access to it. The first contraption is called the Fear Machine, which is supposed to spread fear and panic throughout the entirety of Earth within humans, and then Orion destroys it. So we're all good. Moving forward, in issue 3, we're introduced to Black Racer, like I was talking about before. His alliances don't really have an alignment. And at first, Black Racer is chasing after Light Ray, as Light Ray is trying to go to Earth, but he escapes the Black Racer. The Black Racer is supposed to be faster than anybody else. Light Ray is faster than Death. Or he just evades it in a really cool way, making Black Racer go off somewhere else. So Black Racer actually arrives to Earth, and he does this like Santa Claus switch where he sees this man named Willie Walker, who's an army veteran and a paraplegic. He's not able to vocalize himself. He's taken care of by his sister and her husband, and he's not able to move out of the bed. Willie was about to be killed by a mobster because he was was witness to a murder that happened in front of him that he could see outside of his window. And Black Racer basically just transfers the consciousness over to Willie Walker. But at this time, Willie Walker is able to become the Black Racer, basically being the embodiment of the Black Racer and then providing for an alter ego. When he's not the Black Racer, he's back to being Willie Walker that's confined to a bed and not able to speak. At least being the Black Racer, he would be able to communicate with anybody else. In the next issue, Orion finds out about one of the new gods from New Genesis being murdered. This one is named Sigrin. I can only glean that he had some sort of relation to the power of water, but it's never explained and they don't go into much detail. So during this time, Orion actually seeks out the Deep Six because he knows that they're the ones that killed Sigrin because they're related to water. If you want to know more about this issue, in the previous New Gods analysis video, I talk about the fight between Orion and Slig, which is one of the Deep Six. In the next issue, we open with Metron, and it basically does an exploration of his character. He goes up to this final barrier that will later be referred to as the Source Wall, and it's basically the end of the universe. And Metron wants to know what's beyond that and being able to access more knowledge than what's within this singular universe. Now, of course, the Source Wall has been blown up multiple times, specifically in Dark Knight's Metal, but we haven't been able to go through the eyes of Metron since that's happened to explore outside of it. Now, if you ask Grant Morrison, on the other side of the Source Wall, it's going to be the Marvel Universe, but if you ask Scott Snyder that wrote the follow-up to Dark Knight's Metal, it's Perpetua. Okay, Scott. Also within this issue, Orion fights Slig, which is one of the Deep Six that murdered Sigrin. We find out in this issue during their battle that Orion is heavily disfigured, but uses his mother box to cover his face and transform it from something that's kind of ugly to something that's aesthetically pleasing. It shows that vanity is something that Orion takes seriously, but alternatively can't change what's inside. After the fight, it's revealed that the Deep Six actually made this biological monster for the sea that's supposed to start attacking all of the civilians and whatnot. So Orion goes after that, and then it's revealed that Calabac actually lands on Earth to go and pursue Orion to fight to the death. There's also something really neat about the New Gods and the entirety of the Fourth World, that Jack Kirby was able to provide this additional layer of world building by specifically having extras that highlight additional New Gods that aren't in the main series. One of those New Gods is actually introduced at the end of this issue, and his name is Fastback. Fastback is a lot more arrogant and brash than Lightray, where Lightray is more just full of ambition and wanting to do good. Fastback's a little younger and a lot more inexperienced than Lightray is. So it's good to have this subtle storytelling. As we go forward, I'll also notate some of the additional New Gods that are brought up. In issue 6, Orion is looking for this monster that was created by the Deep Six and then finds a shipwrecked family. I talk about this a lot more in the New Gods analysis video, but the long and short of it is there's a father, son, and a daughter. The father is pro-war and he's a veteran, while the son is a conscientious objector. And they go back and forth throughout the entirety of the issue. And towards the end of the issue, the son steps up when violence is needed, and the father retreats within himself and shows that he's actually a coward. Jack Kirby is utilizing this family as a means to depict the politics at the time between conscientious objectors and people that are blindly supporting the military, saying that it takes more of a man to step up to the military than to blindly follow it. Also within the issue, Orion is taking care of the family, and then Lightray appears to also help his brother in arms. They take down the rest of the Deep Six, and then we move on from there. Alright, so remember earlier whenever I was talking about this truce or the pact that happens between Apocalypse and New Genesis? Issue 7 deals with that and explains what happened between the two warring worlds. So it starts off with Isaiah the Inheritor and his wife Avia as they're lamenting of their love on New Genesis. It's at that time when they're attacked by Steppenwolf. Steppenwolf accidentally kills Avia and sends Isaiah into a blind rage. It's at that time that Darkseid is revealed, and it's also notated that he's the nephew of Steppenwolf and Prince of Apocalypse. Darkseid laments to his uncle that they need to also kill Isaiah to stop any further clash between New Genesis and Apocalypse where they're the problem. So Darkseid seemingly kills Isaiah, and they think that that's the end of it. In retaliation, New Genesis sends an onslaught of an attack towards Apocalypse. This time will be known as the Great Clash. Simultaneously, Darkseid presents his mother's council with a newfound element titled the X element. This is something that's only able to be mined on Apocalypse, but has great value. You see, this is before Metron had his Mobius chair, and the element that Metron needs to power it is the X element. So Darkseid has the X element that will benefit Metron, and in exchange, Metron will aid Apocalypse in their battle. Later on, Steppenwolf leads a raid on New Genesis, and then he comes upon this great warrior. He's then revealed to be Isaiah, who actually survived. Steppenwolf is then immediately killed by Isaiah, and the war rages on. This murder was actually the plan of Darkseid, as Metron laments back to Isaiah. Dealing with this and realizing that he's devolving into the will of Darkseid, he realizes that he can't do this much longer. He renounces falling to the will of Darkseid because New Genesis has to be better. It's at this time that Isaiah goes on a mission to renounce all violence and not fall within the will of Darkseid. While Isaiah is on this mission, he finds the source. So like I said before, the source is really religion for the fourth world. So once Isaiah finds the source and renounces all violence, he's revealed to be Highfather. After this reveal, Metron brokers a deal between Apocalypse and New Genesis, offering both of the leaders to give over their son to the other. Darkseid gives over his bastard son with Tigra named Orion, who is shown to be this feral child that's obsessed with violence and can't trust anybody. But once he's presented to Highfather, Highfather says that there will be no need for violence there, just as there is no need for hate. Inversely, Highfather's son is given over to Darkseid and Granny Goodness. And both of them lament on how they're going to raise him to be a super escape artist that will start the next leg of this war. Because he's going to be a super escape artist, Granny Goodness names him Scott Free, who we'll be talking about later. In the backup for this issue, we do an introduction to Viken the Black. He's going to come up later in the Forever People. In the next issue, Calabac fights Orion, and it's in this fight that Orion shows his true face, one of Apocalypse. Towards the end of the fight, Calabac falls and Light Ray rescues him. But the problem is, Light Ray saw Orion's face. Orion is ashamed by how he looks. But Light Ray says the scars on his face are new and old, but he's only judged by the actions that he does. Basically cleansing Orion of any guilt of his parentage. He is not destined to be Darkseid. He has the opportunity to make his future. Going on from there, we talk about the bugs and Forager. So this is really a weird concept for Kirby to tackle. The bugs live on New Genesis, but they're technically like second-class citizens. And they live beneath New Genesis and treated like others, which is really weird considering that New Genesis is supposed to be heaven. So why is there systemic inequality between the bugs and the people that live on New Genesis? In the issue, one of the followers of Darkseid come to the bugs and try to get all of the bugs to be sympathetic with those of Darkseid. It's only Forager that actually questions the motives, and the one that's coming to the bugs is Mantis, which was previously fought by Orion in previous issues. When Forager questions this, Mantis immediately overthrows the leaders of the bugs and puts the mentor for Forager to be sent to death. Before being executed, Forager's mentor actually tells Forager that he's not one of the bugs, but he's one of the new guys, and he would be the one that could broach a deal between between New Genesis to stop this inequality. Now that Mantis and the forces of Darkseid have overtaken the bug colony, they set their sights on Forager, where Forager escapes through a boom tube and seeks out Orion as told by his mentor. It's at this same time that we cut over to Orion and Lightray, where they try to go back to their previous hideout, but then are captured by police, or seemingly so. Going into the next issue, Forager lands on Earth and then is almost immediately captured by police, and he's sent to the exact same place that the police are holding Orion and Lightray. Very lucky. So Forager warns Orion and Lightray that the forces of Darkseid were coming to Earth, led by Mantis. So all of them break out of police custody and they go on to fight Mantis and the incoming hordes. In the last issue of New Gods, Kalibak breaks out of police custody and goes to fight Orion for the last time. Darkseid then learns of this final battle between Kalibak and Orion and says that fate has kept them apart for a final battle, but if it gets too bad that he's going to intervene. And Desaad is kind of confused and he wonders why Darkseid cares about Orion dying, which he immediately plays down. At first, Lightray attacks Kalibak, trying to save Orion from having to have this last confrontation, but then he's kind of quickly defeated and Orion has to jump in. And Orion is lamenting that this is going to be the last battle. He's going to kill Kalibak. And the Black Racer is coming in and he says that he's going to take one of them, but neither Orion or Kalibak know which one will win and which one will be taken by the Black Racer. It's then that the Black Racer takes Kalibak, leaving Orion to win this final confrontation. Once Orion beats Kalibak, he basically accepts that he is the son of Darkseid, but he's not going to let that define him, and he's going to seek out Darkseid and put an end to the war. Unfortunately, DC didn't let Kirby go on with his story, so this is where the New Gods ended. Until the 1984 return of Jack Kirby, where he kind of bridged the gap between the ending of New Gods originally and an original graphic novel that was titled The Hunger Dog. In this issue, Darkseid has this machination that's able to bring back Steppenwolf, Kalibak, and Desaad. So death is kind of meaningless for any of the New Gods. Okay, so now we get to talk about the Forever People. And the way that I always refer to them is basically the cosmic and hippie teen titan. Now, what do I mean by that? It's a ragtag group of teens that are from New Genesis that come to Earth to fight the forces against Darkseid. The Forever People are made up of 5 members: Viken the Black, Big Bear, Mark Moonrider, Beautiful Dreamer, and Seraphim. So all of them are basically just archetypes of characters, but they don't have a lot of individual personality. Now, before you get the pitchforks out, let me explain. So Kirby basically made the Forever People as the boots on the ground teens that are dealing with the repercussions of the apocalypse invasion of Earth. Although they don't have a lot of individual personalities, they are archetypes of characters that you would know on a team. Big Bear is this lovable brute, kind of like the Thing. Viken is more analytical, and he's the one that handles the mother box for the group. I liken him to Reed Richards. Mark Moonrider is the leader of the group, but he doesn't really have a personality beyond that. The archetype that I associate him with is like a Dick Grayson Robin over the Teen Titans. Beautiful Dreamer is the telepath of the group and the only girl. I kind of liken her to like a Raven or Invisible Woman Sue Storm. And lastly, we have Seraphim, who dresses up like a cowboy, not really explained, and I kind of liken him to like a Johnny Storm. You can kind of tell as the series goes on that those are the archetypes that Kirby gives to the characters, but they don't have much depth beyond that. Yes, they love each other and they're trying to stomp out evil, but they don't have a lot of personality, and that's okay. So all of them use their mother box and they form Infinity Man, which is like a Voltron version of all of them together, and they have this ultimate strength that can go against Darkseid sometimes. So the Forever People is a lot different than New Gods or even Mr. Miracle. It's basically just one-off single issues taking on another leader from Darkseid or tackling Anti-Life where it springs up. In the first issue of the Forever People, and the one that I always recommend to Superman fans, has Jack Kirby writing for Superman and trying to find this kinship with the New Gods. I'm sure I'll talk about it in a later video, but the New Gods signify to Superman what he lost with Krypton. It's something that's a deeper exploration of Superman that most other creators that have written for the character on the main title sometimes just don't get. The New Gods are inherently tied to Superman. So throughout the series, the gang takes on multiple leaders in Darkseid's army and stops them from spreading anti-life. They deal with Mantis, who we talked about before in New Gods, and then they go on to deal with Gordon Godfrey that I talked about in my New Gods analysis video. If you need a refresher, it's basically like a Billy Graham evangelical that's preaching anti-life. I mean, that issue starts off with quoting Adolf Hitler and putting a trance on the people in the audience, saying that they need to embrace anti-life. So like I was saying previously, anti-life is the spreading of fascist rhetoric. In following issues, they take on multiple other villains like Darkseid, who sets up a Disney parody camp that is really just there to torture as many people as possible and spread anti-life that way. And as the series goes on, the acolytes of Gordon Godfrey are labeled the Justifiers, that basically enact all of the things that Nazis did during the Night of Broken Glass by doing public book burnings and taking people out of their home. Kirby is the most overt in the Forever People about tying anti-life to fascism and how they can spring up in everyday people and rhetoric. Two minor additional characters need to be noted. One of them is Sunny Sumo, which is a wrestler and a quote-unquote warrior, but then it turns out that he can find the mother box, and also he has the anti-life equation in him, but he never is susceptible to it, and that's basically where we leave him. He helps the team get outside of the clutches of Darkseid, and then is relegated back to Japan, never to be seen or heard from again. The next character is Lonar, which is like this archaeologist that's digging through New Genesis, and he finds remnants of the old gods with his war horse named Thunderer. He doesn't really pop up in any of the other books. He's just kind of interesting to have like an Indiana Jones take in the New Gods. In the series, it's also where Final Crisis gets the idea of the Omega Beams sending Batman back in time, because these Omega Beams that Darkseid has, he uses against the Forever People, and it basically separates them all throughout history, and then they have to come back together, yada yada yada. In following issues, they take down people that are spreading anti-life but don't work for Darkseid necessarily. There's this one billionaire that basically makes his own military, and he spreads anti-life because he has quote-unquote the power, which basically means that whatever he says other people have to do, and he didn't know that that's actually anti-life. It's very subtle, so it might go over your head, but it's saying that billionaires are bad people. In the penultimate issue, they have the Scavengers, which are basically like super arms dealers that the Forever People have to take down. Also saying that the military-industrial complex is a bad thing. Come on, guys, keep up with me. In the last issue, we're introduced to Devilance the Pursuer, which is supposed to be like an acolyte of Darkseid, and he's trying to get rid of them once and for all. It doesn't really happen. The issue ends with the Forever People being sent to this alternate dimension that's outside of the realm of Darkseid. That's where we leave them. Okay, so Mr. Miracle is the last on this lineup. It's not only the most successful at time of publication, but it's the most successful going forward. What I mean by this is that Mr. Miracle ran for 18 issues, compared to New Gods and the Forever People only ran for 11 each. DC saw more of a long haul with Mr. Miracle than they did with New Gods and the Forever People, hence why he continued to be a character and have his own series outside of those titles. There's a lot that you need to know about this character and how he ties into the war between New Genesis and Apocalypse. So I referenced him earlier. He is the son of Highfather that was given over to Darkseid. Darkseid and Granny Goodness named him scot-free. Get it? Because he needs to escape. So he becomes the super escape artist. He escapes any scenario that he's put in. And if you read all of these issues, every single issue will deal with him escaping some kind of death trap. But what sells me on the series is not the action in every issue. While it is good the majority of the time, it's the relationships between Scott Free and everybody surrounding him. Kirby made this outside of the realm of just being a political allegory and dealing with kingdoms fighting. It's just a story about one man who needs to escape and the family that he builds around him. If you already know Scott Free, then you most likely already know Big Barda. And their love story throughout this series is really captivating. The most interesting aspect is that Kirby based Big Barda after his wife, Roz Kirby. So for everything that Scott lacks, Big Barda has. She's abrasive, she's a larger woman, she's the leader of the Female Furies, which is like the individual core arm of Darkseid's army and like the leading lieutenants. On top of that, there's this underlying revelation that this character has spawned this rebellion that leads more people to leave Darkseid's side and go to New Genesis and want to be individuals. Mr. Miracle captures the idea of radical freedom and being able to choose your own destiny. He does so by radicalizing Big Barda and thus the Female Furies to leave the side of Darkseid. Okay, so let's start off with the series. So it turns out Scott Free's not even Mr. Miracle, at least not the first one. Scott arrives to Earth and witnesses an escape artist named Thaddeus Brown, also known as Mr. Miracle. Scott quickly befriends both Thaddeus Brown and his assistant, Oberon. It should be noted that a lot of Oberon's tendencies is just inputting Jack Kirby, similar to the way that he did for The Thing. So when I read Oberon, I hear Jack Kirby's voice. But basically the series goes on to say that Thaddeus Brown had a bet with one of the people that are the head of Inner Gang, basically saying that he can escape any trap that somebody sets for him. But you know what you can't escape? Death. Except for the Mr. Miracle 2017 series by Mitch Gerrits and Tom King. I guess you can escape it? I don't know, it's nebulous. So then Inner Gang kills Thaddeus Brown and Scott takes over the mantle of being Mr. Miracle and goes after Inner Gang. From there, they start working on some of his escape artist tricks to gain money and also plan on touring the world. I don't know, it's kind of like a side plot, it doesn't really matter. The entirety of the series has Granny Goodness trying to capture Scott Free because he escaped from Apocalypse and specifically her care. So what you need to know about Granny Goodness, and we talked about it with my interview with Ram V, but she's like the world's worst extremist because not only did Scott Free get out of there, but then also Big Barda and all of the Female Furies. So like, she is not really good at brainwashing. She basically runs this orphanage that's supposed to breed extremists, but once she loses Scott, he takes Barda later on, and she gets all of the Female Furies to follow her. So what's her point? So throughout the series, we basically follow Scott as he tries to outmaneuver all of the death traps set for him by Granny Goodness or other leaders and followers of Darkseid. Just to name a few, there's Dr. Bedlam, who basically makes you see your worst fear, aptly named. Then there's also Vermin Wunderbar. I talked about it earlier, but he's basically like Space Hitler, which is even funnier because within the series, it's even noted that he's like a LARPer because he only is infatuated with like 1940s Germany and everybody doesn't like him because he's trying to be this fascist on Earth rather than like being a part of the pantheon of Apocalypse. He's a dweeb, and even Kirby admits that he sucks and everybody hates him. And then lastly, we have Kanto. I think Kanto is really interesting. He's basically also a LARPer, weirdly enough, but he's got this weird morality where he dresses up like he's a part of the Renaissance era. And once Scott Free gets out of one of his contraptions, he's basically like, oh, cool, man. Like, that's neat. All right, you're good to go. And Granny Goodness tries to call him out on it, and he's like, well, it is what it is. And then she's fine with it, which is like very weird and out of character, but go on. So as we dive into the series and the relationship between Scott and Barda, it turns out that Scott actually radicalized Barda to leave not only the female Furies, but then to go after him and be with him on Earth. There's backups within Mr. Miracle that are different than the ones done on New Gods and Forever People. With Mr. Miracle, we actually get to look at Scott Free in the orphanage and how he learned his destiny over time, all leading up to an issue to actually show him leaving Apocalypse and how he did that. This brings in Hyman. So Hyman is actually like this rebellious figure that lives on Apocalypse, and he's completely ousted, and everybody wants to tell Darkseid where he is because they also hate him because he goes against Darkseid's ideals. The thing is, Hyman finds Scott Free and is told by Metron that Scott Free is the son of Highfather and they need to get him out of there. So Hyman trains Scott Free, and in doing so also meets Barda, and Barda is also radicalized to help Scott get out of Apocalypse. Hyman not only teaches Scott how to be a super escape artist, but then on top of that, he reveals that he was the one that found the source, and he's the one that linked Mother Box technology to the source to get them to work. So he's been operating on Apocalypse, but sending all of this information not only to Metron, but to Highfather and all of New Genesis. The thing with Hyman, at least in my reading of him, is that Jack Kirby was showing that even in the darkest of places, like Apocalypse, there are still people trying to do good. I don't know, I absolutely loved it. There's also a very like out of place issue, but I absolutely love it and I actually own it. If you look at my wall on the normal videos, it's sitting up there, but it's the introduction of Funky Flashman and Houseroy. Now, a lot of people already know this, but it's worth repeating. Funky Flashman and Houseroy are a scathing critique of not only Stan Lee, but his assistant and number 2 at Marvel, Roy Thomas. Basically saying that Funky uses these flowery words and language to influence the people around him while only trying to better himself, and his closest personal assistant, Houseroy, the stand-in for Roy Thomas, is constantly berated and abused and only stays there because he thinks that he's going to get the inheritance that Funky Flashman holds. It is the clearest insight into how Jack Kirby felt about Stan Lee and Roy Thomas. So as the story goes on, Scott and Barda are going against the forces of Darkseid, and basically they're met with the female Furies, which Barda immediately gets them over to their side, and now they're just part of the family. It doesn't take a lot of convincing either. They see Barda as their leader, so they're gonna do what she says until she offers them a choice. The entirety of the Fourth World Saga is about choice and not letting somebody else dictate your future. So the last little bit that I want to hit on is Shiloh Norman. Shiloh is vastly interesting because it's basically Jack Kirby setting up for a legacy character to take over the mantle of Mr. Miracle. Shiloh witnessed his brother's murder and is gone after by this gang that wants to kill him because he's a witness. But at the end of the issue, Scott and Barda offer to take in Shiloh because he doesn't have anybody else to live with and they don't want him to go off into the system. Plus, he has abilities that could be honed to give him more autonomy. So throughout the last 3 issues, it's basically Scott and Barda training Shiloh to be able to be Mr. Miracle in the future. I just absolutely love it. And whenever people say Jack Kirby would be turning in his grave because of legacy characters that don't match their skin tone, just look at Shiloh Norman. Like, he loved that. So because Mr. Miracle went 18 issues and was finalizing way after New Gods and Forever People were wrapped up, he basically used the last issue, number 18, as a means to wrap up his time because he was going to be leaving DC to go back to Marvel. In the issue, he has Scott and Barda get married, and Scott gets to meet Highfather, Orion, Lightray, all of these people that have only been tangential but actually haven't appeared within the series. Basically using this as like a nice end cap to put on the entirety of the Fourth World Saga because Kirby knew he was leaving. Okay, so now we're going to go into the recommended reading, additionally from Jack Kirby's original series. So we have New Gods by Mark Evanier and Paris Cullins, Orion by Walt Simonson, Mr. Miracle by J.M.D. Mateus and Paris Cullins, Forever People by J.M.D. Mateus and Paris Cullins, Justice League International by J.M.D. Mateus, Keith Giffen, and Kevin Maguire, Barda by Ngozi Ukazu, and Mr. Miracle Source of Freedom by Brandon Easton and Fico Ossio. So basically just breaking down some of this, all of this area all the way down to JLI are ones that have been done since Kirby left, and then Barda and Mr. Miracle Source of Freedom are both newer entries into the fourth world, with Barda being tackled by a writer/artist that I'm starting to be a really big fan of, and I really appreciate their voice. Also on top of that, if you want more Shiloh Norman as Mr. Miracle, I definitely recommend Brandon Easton, as this is kind of self-contained in the most part and able to be accessible. And all of these series are supplemental material, but it's not necessary when going into the New Gods #1. So I just wanted to make this video to cover everything that you would possibly need to know if you're kind of hesitant before jumping into the New Gods #1. I understand. So I wanted to make this video that was dedicated to the people that are apprehensive and basically just shepherd them into the fourth world for the first time. I hope you guys liked the video. I'm trying something new. And if you did, go ahead and click that playlist or subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And don't forget, go read some comics. Or else.